2016, 4 years ago, the UK held a referendum on whether they should remain an EU member state or whether they should vote to leave, and by a margin of 52% to 48%, they decided it was finally time to leave the EU. On 2020, Friday, January 31st, in Downing Street, at the stroke of midnight, the UK left the EU as the recorded sounds of the Big Ben bongs loud for Brexit. And now they are under a transition process till the end of this very year. On the other end, the EU sits in dismal. Now, just like baggage in a relationship, the EU has a ton of baggage. Observe: ideological baggage, immigration baggage, refugees baggage, Russia baggage, economic baggage, historical baggage, liberal institutional baggage, etc. So much baggage. And that's so hard to carry on the weight on such very delicate shoulders. Now, unfortunately, these baggages are not nice carry-on sized luggages. So the EU's relationship status? It's complicated. Now, while much can be said in terms of the arguments about the down pits of the EU, I'm simply here today to present you 4 quintessential arguments out of many, very many, which I will figuratively denote as baggages, to illustrate not only the EU's eventual fate to Dante's Inferno of Hell, as I like to call it, but also why the UK and the EU are never ever getting back together. Like ever, and why a re-entry is actually quite inconceivable. Now, let's talk about baggage claim number 1, the economic baggage toll. So one might say that one of the EU's undeniable legacies is contingent upon its revered unified single economy. Now, whether you're conscious of it or not, the EU's baggage is sort of like having dozens of heavy pound rocks in your bag, make no mistake. You, being the EU, might say, oh, it's not that bad. But really, it's not that bad from the first mile, or maybe even the second mile. But once you walk those tens and twentieths and hundreds of miles, those dozens of heavy pound rocks begin to take its toll on your back. It's part of the aging process as the EU keeps expanding in size and growing in its budget as well. And this is exactly what is happening to the EU. The EU is under siege and they cannot afford to keep up their antics in the long haul. Now, why do you ask? Well, let's take this analogy a step further, shall we? Given the EU's baggages are incandescently large and heavy luggages, they need to be checked in. And if you can't keep the weight of your luggages in control, not surpassing a certain limit, the overweight luggage fee kicks in with an extra $150 or $200, or I don't know. And in parallel to the EU's case, a total baggage fee of 165.8 billion euros, which roughly translates to 184,728,557,000 United States dollars. Now that's a boatload of money, but guess who's one of the biggest contributor nations to this lofty and luxurious budget? You guessed it, the UK. So imagine the consequences that arise out of a nation that is opting out. The EU is collapsing, and not just the EU, but liberal institutions in general, or at least on the road to do so. And the UK is the first domino in that stack, the first to open up a whole can of worms. Maybe not the first, because of course there was Greenland, historically speaking, but it was leaving the EEC, not the EU as a whole. And the EU is like a house made of cards, and it's falling apart when you take that one card out, which is the UK. The EU's budget is simply far too ambitious, and why? Well, here's the big question. Who's going to pay for it? Who will agree to pay for it? Who will take on the burden of this lofty budget? The EU's ambitions should be matched with reliable funding. The frugals, the Netherlands, Denmark, namely Austria and Sweden, and even Germany, complain they are being asked to shoulder too much of the budget's costs and have insisted on keeping rebates that are reviled elsewhere in the bloc, namely France. Now, naturally, Brexit has been discussed in a totally British-centered, if not Anglo-centric way, but little attention has been paid to what it would do to the balance of power within the contributing bloc of the 27 nations. The working assumption must be that it will strengthen the position of the European integrationists, which I argue there's a lot of Euroscepticism to balance that out, if not more. And with Angela Merkel retiring soon, France seems destined again to assume a leadership role in Europe, and President Macron believes that the answer to a European Union's problems is a more Europe. How is that so when Europe is actually very disunited in many different ways, which I will discuss in my next point? How can it be when it's so disunited and can hardly account to what's happening on its own grounds and just continuously expands passively? So, anyways, this means a fiscal union and a banking union to match the monetary union and single currency. Yet, that is something that nations such as Sweden or Netherlands, Finland, and Germany, far richer and more solvent nations, will never find acceptable. Put bluntly, it means putting their taxpayers' money in a permanent obligation to rescue bankrupt nations and banks in, I don't know, the south of Alps. And is it, just to point out, is it really a union if you're not contributing your fair share to the budget? Just a question mark. In the meantime, the rise of nationalists in Italy and Poland and Hungary are driven by hostility to Brussels and failures in immigration, which means that the EU project is actually unpopular even in places where it has been of huge economic benefit. And need not I mention the catastrophe of Greece, who really suffered after 2008, and I guess Italy as well. Now, to simply discuss one sticking point as to why Brexit came to be. One sticking matter was that Britain is being held back by the EU and is a victim of the bureaucrats that who are controlling the businesses and charge billions of pounds a year in membership fees for little in return. Now, one of the main arguments for leaving the EU is that it would result in immediate cost savings, as the country would essentially no longer have to contribute to the EU budget. That is, the UK could keep the money that is initially supposed to contribute to the EU itself for the UK's government, instead to decide on its own terms how to spend it, which is very advantageous. And quite frankly, there is a lot of criticism towards the UK and their handling of the coronavirus outbreak, with Boris Johnson recently contracting it and whatnot. But I can argue right now, and not in depth because of time's sake, but just to mention that the EU's handling is arguably far worse and far more detrimental to them as a very large institution, and that the UK, thanks to Brexit, actually has a better advantage in handling it. Now, of course, for time's sake, I will not discuss that right here. Now, moving back, the EU's anti-democratic structure gives far too much power to corporate elites and prevents the UK from making any significant gains, particularly economically. Another point is, the UK actually has better deals outside of the EU. Namely, we have the US under Trump, who is banded with the UK because he harps upon liberal institutions, as we know, and basically wants to see them burn and crash into flames. And others are willing as well, such as Australia, New Zealand, possibly China, which they already have a relationship going in terms of the 5G mobile network services. Now, the UK pays so much more for far less in return when it's in the EU as a major contributor nation, much like how Trump pays a hefty percentage for the United Nations and other quite futile institutions as well. The fact that the EU is so desperately trying to latch onto the UK is actually quite telling and revealing in itself, especially when it comes to matters of finance. With their lofty budget, if more and more nations seem to cascadingly exit in the near or far future, losing contributor and non-contributor nations alike, the EU prospects for the future will not look too swell. Now, on the other side in the discussion table, concerning Britain, some say that Brexit is the death blow to England and its economy will come crashing down. Well, here's why Brexit is actually a chance to fix the UK's long-term economic problems, and how Brexit is actually an opportunity and not a threat. Let's dispel some facts here. Firstly, growth rates since joining the EEC in 1973 has been slower than in decades before entry. As far as the UK is concerned, between re-entry in 1973 and Brexit, there have been 4 recessions, 3 booms and busts in the housing market, and gradual erosion of manufacturing capacity. Periods of sustained growth, first in the 1980s and again more enduringly in the 1990s and early 2000s, culminated in very painful slumps. And the structural problems of the economy go back decades, but have become really impossible to ignore since the financial crisis of 2008. And for the 100 years before the financial crisis, output per worker grew by about 2% a year on average, but since 2010 it had slowed to 0.5% a year. Had it continued to grow at its former rate, the economy would actually be at least 20% bigger than it currently is. Now, the UK's growth rate since it joined was what was then the EEC in 1973 had been slower than it was in decades preceding the entry. What's more, the growth has been concentrated in one corner of the economy, London and Southeast, and this is a very common problem all throughout Europe. The distribution of wealth in a liberal institution doesn't live up. It's quite a hypocrisy. How is that a unity? And the creation of the single market in the 1980s did not lead to an acceleration of Europe's growth rate, in large part because of the thrusts of economic policy that's so obsessed with the control of inflation and budget deficits that held countries back. Europe has world-class companies, but none of them were set up in the past 30 years. There's no equivalent to, say, Facebook or Amazon or Google. The reason, actually, why the UK has turned to Huawei to build its 5G mobile network, because the Chinese company is ahead of Europe's rivals, Nokia and Ericsson. Waiting for the EU to sort out its deep-seated problems could be a long process, and little progress has been made on creating a banking union, having a centralized budget presided over by an EU finance minister. And Germany, comfortably the most powerful player, fears that speeding up economic integration, one way of making the euro actually function more effectively, would leave it bankrolling or, supporting the rest of Europe, which is not in its interest. Brexit supporters left and right say that leaving the EU actually creates policy space to try out different things, which is a big plus. For example, the UK is one of the world's leaders in artificial intelligence and could seize a competitive advantage once it can set its own regulations. Similarly, the Prime Minister floated about the idea during the election campaign that the government will use the freedom from the EU state aid and procurement rules to help manufacturing. This was one of the arguments actually deployed by, I believe, Tony Benn when he was attacking the EEC from the left in the 1970s. So not much has changed historically. As then, Brexiteers think there is far more a chance of solving Britain's long-term economic problems, such as big trade deficits, lack of competitiveness, etc., from the outside looking in. Now, segueing to baggage claim number 2, a European identity. Oh, the irony. A union that is so disunited. Oh, the irony. That claims to be working for the welfare of the people, but instead reaps from them, and the concentration of wealth goes to selected Eurocrats. Sounds more like a subsidy to me than a partnership, doesn't it? Oh, the irony of a nation that is so big and vast and yet so weak and minuscule in its true nature, because this is a liberal institution, after all, that favors mutual cooperation and all that lovely jazz that doesn't really hold up to the wall of reality. Oh, the irony that claims to champion democracy where all the people are well off and represented, but masses of its own people beg to differ. The EU can't seem to hold itself together in many reasonable respects and is quite arguably jettisoning. And need not I mention nationalism and radicalism that are eminently on the high rise, especially in the north of Europe and all across, really, with the rise of nationalists in Italy and Poland and Hungary, as said. And just to mention, they can't even come to agreements on a basic European constitution. I mean, every time the Eurocrats round up in the discussion table in Brussels, they debate and argue all day and all night long, even days long, and they cannot even come to a sound conclusion, which is very telling. I mean, what a load of EU hypocrisy and bureaucracy. The power is centered on Brussels, Germany, France, and hardly to the rest of Europe. If Eurocrats or pro-EU goers were to harp about a potential EU army as well in the near or far-wide future, this also falls back into the salient reality of a truly disconcerted Europe. Speaking hypothetically, would German soldiers want to fight or be dragged into a hypothetical war outside of Europe just because their French allies told them so, and now they're obliged to risk millions of their own people's lives for a war that doesn't really concern them? The EU army can hardly hold true if a united Europe hardly holds true in itself. Also, let's remember the idea that the bigger you grow as an empire, the harder it is to manage and the more likely you will crash and you will decline. We've seen this with the glorious empires of the past, with the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, and yet they all came crashing down as they continued to expand. It became harder and harder to manage when you have too many chefs in the kitchen, right? So, why would Britain identify with a nation that is so clueless about its own identity? Britain is a prideful nation of its own right, and perhaps they should seek their more familiar identity that they can call their own and seek out their lawful right to self-determination. Perhaps it's time they figured out that a one-size policy doesn't fit all. Now, moving on to baggage claim number 3, the immigration crisis. Oh, now, I know what you're thinking. You're bringing up immigration? That's racist. Well, let me hold your horses right there and allow me to dispel one of the common misconceptions here. So, the question of immigration is quite often brought up, and I'm here to say that it is a logical fallacy. It's a false clause that apparently X implies Y and whatnot. It's wrong. It's a complete doublespeak. It's sort of like saying every time I go to sleep, the sun goes down. In the same way, immigration does not mean racism as a connotation. It's not about racism or xenophobia. Controlling immigration is actually good for democracy, and capping the numbers is good for sovereignty. It's not about discrimination against a race, just to point that and make that clear. It's about putting your people first, just like how you would put your parents first before anyone else. Of course, it's also about costs and the cost of immigration and economics and putting the labor in the hands of locals at first. But just a question here, isn't it a basic fact of human life that we tend to be closer to those who share something with us, generally speaking? Well, here's my follow-up question. If 2 people were drowning in a pool, and one of them was your mother and the other was a complete random stranger, who would you save? Be honest. Your mother. Why? Because you have a bond with her. Whether you agree to it or not, the matter of the fact is we as humans have a natural tendency to prioritize some people over others, especially in the face of urgency or danger. We may not hate the stranger that's drowning, namely the immigrant. It's just a matter of prioritizing your mother or your motherland first, who raised you, whom you grew up with, whom you identify with. And in the same way, as Britons, you have a right to feel for your motherland or fatherland or whatever you call. We have a natural need for belonging. Loving your wife compared to other women does not denigrate any other women. Also, culture will diminish with open borders or change into a completely redefined culture. You might argue that there's something called a melting pot and that we have British Americans or British Indians and whatnot, and that it's discriminatory to claim otherwise. But really, the existence of a melting pot derives firstly from root ethnic-based identities and ethnically sound communities. It's also part of your natural sovereignty to control entry to your land and your laws. And the fact that some, if not many, immigrants fail to assimilate is really concerning. Why come into a culture and refuse the nation's culture when it isn't your country for say in that as much? If immigrants want to live in the UK and benefit from its wealth and kindness, by all means they should. But they should come part of the culture that made the UK so great. They should work on working hard and being profitable members of society, obeying the laws, respecting their neighbors. And of course, they should be legal in status as well. I mean, what part of illegal does anyone not understand? Also, can you really save everyone? As much as we'd like to, it's hard to save every refugee or invite every immigrant. Of course, there's a distinction between refugees and immigrants out there because we have budgetary constraints and the interest of giving jobs to local people at first at stake. So if you say it's discriminatory, realistically speaking, it's a fallacy. It's a logical fallacy, and it's simply a matter of priority. It does not imply hate or racism. Now, this is all because of this EU essential belief system of the 4 freedoms, right? That includes the freedom of movement. However, this freedom of movement seems to be more of a curse than a blessing. Now, baggage claim number 4. Rejoining procedure is harder and unclear to imagine. So, here's a reason why. Firstly, we never had a country leave the EU. So we don't actually know what the rejoining procedure exactly entails, but what it kind of vaguely states is that if you would like to join the EU, you would have to fulfill certain EU criteria to rejoin again or join at all. You cannot simply say, hey, I used to be here, can you let me back in? No, you have to join in like a new member would. As such, the Copenhagen criteria still does apply here. So let's dive into the PDF file of the EU Parliament themselves for the Copenhagen criteria. Let's look at the things that the UK needs to fulfill in order to join it again. There's basically four main criteria. You need to have a stability of institutions to guarantee democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and respect for minorities, and the existence of a functioning market economy. Now, we're not worried about the democracy and a non-market economy part because I don't think any of us can imagine the UK being not a democracy or a non-market economy anytime soon in the next 20 or even 50 or anytime soon in the future. So you might ask, what's the big deal here? Well, the other big thing is if you wish to join the EU, there's a presupposed candidate's ability to take on obligations of membership, including adherence to the aims of political, economic, and monetary union. Now, when you join the EU right now, it's not going to be the same as joining in the 60s or in the 70s when the UK first applied and later got into. Because obviously the EU is much bigger of an organization today with a lot of different additional institutions and facets as well. Now, as for the UK and the statement of political, economic, and monetary union, they are very much opposed to this and always have been, and we will see why. So the first problem is the Eurozone. Concerning the Eurozone, i.e. the countries under a common EU currency, the UK can be seen as the most against this since history till present. Joining the EU, the Euro, is something that the UK specifically negotiated and opted out for. They do not want to join the EU currency bandwagon. However, it's found as a rule in the EU that you're legally obliged to join in at some point, and in all of these policies, as a matter of fact. This means that joining the Euro is pretty much an obligation at some point that the UK will have to face again. And actually, if you look at all the other countries that are obliged to join in all these policies, there's quite a number of nations who consistently dodge this as well. And the EU is simply waiting there like, you guys, are you going to join because you have an obligation? Now, again, we can argue the EU and liberal institutions have no effective mechanism and can't really tell anyone what to do. So if the UK were to rejoin, they would have to come to face this problem once again. And as we know, rejoining is very different from remaining, so that's one of the consequences. Now, in addition, there's another opt-out to be concerned, a very big one, which is the Schengen area, which we know as basically a passport union where you can go all the way from, say, Portugal to maybe Finland and whatnot, where no passport checks are required. And this is the next big issue. This essentially makes nation borders more into a province border in Canada or like state borders in the US. And the UK and Ireland, they have their own kind of separate passport union, but anyway, they would have to face this problem as well. Now, the issue with this in particular is that it removes your ability to have your own national border policy, which would make a lot of people that are pro-leave even more incessantly pro-leave, and people who are pro-remain actually jump and hop onto the other side. But just in addition to that, what are the other opt-outs? There's a lot of other opt-outs, including the Charter of Fundamental Rights, the former opt-out of the UK that they used to have back in the 90s, which is the social chapter. But moreover, in general, the opt-out of an ever closer union, because fundamentally speaking, the main goal or aim of the EU is to become an ever closer union over time. Ever since its conception, this has been the goals, to have a proper political union, which I beg to differ, it's hardly translating as such, and maybe even one day become a country like, quote unquote, a United States of Europe, more like an EU-SSR, if you ask me. Let's not forget the famous rebate that Margaret Thatcher, I believe, struck up in the past. While the EU has a set of weird rebates going around from several different countries, the UK's rebate is like the mother of all rebates. So if it were to rejoin, this would essentially be gone, and it would have to join in on more expensive terms. So in fact, the whole point here is that Whether you think Brexit was a mistake or not, it's a fact that it would have to rejoin on less favorable terms overall. The euro would be an assumption, the Schengen, losing access to your own border policy, etc. Having to join all these policies and organizations again would really, as said, make the EU come from a position of weakness. All in all, the UK, if it rejoins, it can't simply undo what has been done anyway over the past 4 years and before that, and the UK would be placed in a situation where it would pay more money for less favorable entry. And just historically speaking as well, the UK was never in favor of remaining in the EU. The UK was never pro-EU army, never pro-EU state, or pro-ever closer union. And need not I mention the north of Europe with a very strong Euroscepticism towards the EU, which can definitely be felt in the UK as well. So one can imagine why joining in a set of worse conditions is really a bad idea. So what is the takeaway message here as a conclusion? That it's time to get to the bottom of this, pun intended, and to let that baggage go, that liberal institutional fantasy go. The UK has finally removed that baggage, and now they can go out into the world and say, wow, my shoulders and muscles haven't moved like that for the past 47 years over our membership. Indeed, it is time to lighten that load and unleash the UK and every individual nation, European nation, to their utmost and fullest potential.